I'm really pleased to be moderating this important panel. It feels often in the journalism community and the press freedom community that we talk a lot about impunity, but unfortunately we don't see a lot of change, and I think this is an opportunity for us to think about how we might do things differently so that we can really start to see change and we can start to see justice for the killings of journalists. And that's because over the past decade, the killings of journalists have remained staggeringly and stubbornly high, the unsolved killings. CPJ's 2021 Impunity Index showed that no one had been held to account in at least 81% of journalist murders over the last 10 years. That's at least 226 deaths, 226 individuals with families, loved ones, and colleagues who have had no justice for their murders. In many cases, it's not always easy to establish a link between the journalist activity and their killing. And that's why we think at the Committee to Protect Journalists that investigations are so key, a key method for achieving justice. It's 10 years since the establishment of the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists, and yet the situation for the safety of journalists is worsening globally. And I believe, and we believe, that failure to punish those responsible for journalist killings is part of what's helping to foster this environment of poor press freedom, danger for journalists. To discuss this today, I've got a fantastic panel here in the room and also remotely. Oh, I can see Matthew now. Hello, Matthew. And we're going to have some moderated discussion and then open up for questions. So on my left is Abderrahim Foukara, Aljazeera's Washington, D.C. bureau chief, a veteran journalist who has unique insights not just into US politics, but also the Middle East. He previously served as a correspondent for BBC World Service and for Public Radio International. To his left is Paula Saucedo, the Protection and Defense Program Officer at the Mexico office of the press freedom organization Article 19. Saucedo is a human rights defender and has worked with several NGOs, UN and international cooperation agencies on issues including press freedom, gender-based violence, and the rights of migrants. And then finally joining us remotely, Matthew Caruana Galizia is an investigative journalist and director of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to achieving justice for Matthew's mother, Daphne, a prominent Maltese journalist and blogger who reported on government corruption and was killed by a car bomb in 2017. Abderrahim, I want to start with you and to talk about the case of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. She was killed over 4 months ago. We've seen Israel recognize that she was killed by an Israeli soldier. We haven't had the naming of the soldier. We haven't had anything beyond that. I wonder if you can talk about what Al Jazeera has been doing to establish justice for Shireen and her family, and what roadblocks you've seen in trying to get that justice and accountability.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. How much time do I have?
It's 3 minutes to start, and then we can, but we will come back, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just very quickly reiterate the point that you made in your introduction. These events, a lot of these events are held for us to talk about impunity for the killers of journalists. And are we in a situation where, to borrow from T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in the room, women come and go, talking to Michelangelo? Or do these meetings actually serve a purpose? And I believe that they do serve a purpose. Words are very important in terms of trying to keep the issue of impunity front and center of the attention of the international community as a whole. Words have a meaning, they have an impact. And when you combine the credibility of an institution like the International Press Institute and Columbia University, that's a very powerful combination for those who want to listen to the message. Top of those, under the circumstances, are the US government in terms of what they're doing to press the Israelis to do what we all know they ought to do in terms of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, but also to try and help press other governments and other entities when it comes to killing journalists and ending impunity. We are lucky, I mean, we have, as the Chinese say, if you don't say what needs to be said, what needs to be done doesn't get done. And you know, we are still lucky that this country, the United States, there's words, and the press freedom still is very important. If you'll allow me very quickly, I have to seize this opportunity. We are here to honor Shireen and the other journalists who've been killed, but let me talk about, for 30 or 40 seconds, about the living, or at least 4 living journalists from Aljazeera who have been detained in Egypt for several years now. Rabi' Mohammed Abdel Wahid al-Sheikh, born in 1983, went to Egypt to vacation, and he was detained there in 2021. His preventive detention was renewed several times. In fact, 12 times for 15 days, 1 time for 45 days. Still has not been seen or tried, but he continues to be detained in Egypt. Abdelaziz Gharib, born in 1977, member of IPI, by the way, same thing. Same thing, went to Egypt on vacation. He was detained, this was 2019, and he was actually released on bail, 20,000 Egyptian pounds, only to disappear for another month. And then he cropped up in Tora prison, where he's been held since 2019. Thank you. Third one, Bahauddin Ibrahim Na'matullah, born in 1976, also IPI member, also went to Egypt for his vacation in February of 2020, and his preventive detention has been renewed multiple times. He has not been tried yet. He is still in detention. Last one, Ahmed al-Najdi, Abu al-Ila Ibrahim al-Sha'ir. Check this one out. 67 years old, born in 1955, serious case of diabetes. Still also a member of the International Press Institute. He's been held in Egypt since 2020 without trial. Now, the dead, Shireen. Aljazeera has been very clear right from the beginning that the bullet that killed Shireen was an Israeli bullet, and that the bullet that killed Shireen Abu Akleh was an Israeli bullet fired, and the soldier who fired it knew that he was trying to kill Shireen Abu Akleh. That's been Aljazeera's official position right from the start. And you know, investigations by the New York Times, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the UN Human Rights Council, they've all gone in the same direction. I'll take that. They've all gone in the same direction. We know the bullet was Israeli. Now the Israelis are saying it's very likely. They've changed their version 7 times, but now they're saying it's very likely that you know that Shireen was killed by an Israeli bullet. But there's not, as far as they're concerned, there's not going to be an investigation. And with the position of the US government, we found ourselves in this surreal situation whereby they issued a statement, the State Department did, saying that they want accountability, but they're pressing the Israelis to change the rules of engagement so that future journalists do not get killed. But what happens in the current case of Shireen Abu Akleh and accountability, the State Department does not say, at least not in public. If they're saying something to the Israelis in private, I don't know what they're telling them. So how do we change this situation of impunity for the killers of journalists? I would briefly say that we should start with ourselves as journalists, because I'm extremely grateful to all the journalists who have shown support for the case, for the cause of Shireen Abu Akleh in multiple ways. But at the end of the day, we haven't seen, whether in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh or in the case of journalists who are killed in other parts of the world, we are here in the United States, our neighbors in Mexico, journalists get killed every what? Left, right, and center, yeah. We haven't seen the kind of mass mobilization by journalists themselves.
Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. I think part of it is still that case where if it does not affect me personally, I do not necessarily have to deal with it. We know that if it happened to Shireen, it could happen to you, it could happen to me, it could happen to any other journalist. And therefore, journalists have to accept that just because it hasn't happened to them or to somebody they don't personally know, it doesn't mean that it couldn't happen to them. There was a time when most of the journalist issues that the world dealt with were from the global south. And now we see people from the north also getting affected by this. I'm talking about the James Foleys, and I'm talking about the Austin Tices of the world. So we have to accept that we are all in this together, and unless we make it a combined voice, our voice will not go very far. Obviously, you'll never be able to mobilize every single journalist on earth for any particular cause, but if you can create a reasonable, sustainable, and consistent level of mobilization, it would be helpful. Just one final thought, and I'll shut up, I promise. The issue of Shireen in particular, if I may just use that as an example, because there's a whole plethora of similar cases that we could talk about. We are in New York. Not far from here is the United Nations. The United Nations is obviously, to all intents and purposes, extremely concerned with and about press freedom and the safety and security of journalists, and we hear statements every day about that issue. But we know the United Nations in particular is the Wall Street of international influence. If you have a case by an Israeli soldier who killed a journalist, for example, and you have a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council defending that particular country, it's gonna be hard to achieve justice. But justice, it's a lofty goal. We should all strive for it. But I think, realistically speaking, we're not going to get justice every time we have a case of impunity.
And I want to come back to you afterwards to talk about kind of levers of power, because that strikes me as one of the main issues that we've seen over the past decade, is working out how you can really move the needle effectively. What is it that's going to push people? And I know your Aljazeera is pushing for certainly an international criminal court investigation, a US investigation, and I want to sort of come back to that. But you referenced Mexico. We know that in terms of impunity, Mexico is one of the worst countries globally. We've pushed organizations like Article 19, pushed very hard for a federal protection mechanism, and yet journalists who are under that mechanism have been killed. Can you talk, Paula, a little bit about the efforts that have been made to protect journalists and what you think is, where you think the failures are in enforcing that and improving the situation for the safety of journalists?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you again also for the invitation from IPI and CPJ. It's just so many things, like violence against the press is caused by multiple factors, right? So to summarize why the mechanism for protection doesn't work, I mean, it does work for some things, but not really to prevent violence, because it's just one entity that is part of the Ministry of Interior. It's not even one big ministry. It's part of this Interior Ministry, and then they have a reactive approach, right? You have to, in order for you to be a beneficiary of this mechanism, you already have to receive or be victim of death threats or physical attacks or you name it. So from the beginning, the approach is not preventive. That's one thing. And secondly, the major number of attacks, or the majority of attacks against the press in Mexico and in the region, are perpetrated by public servants, around 50% of the attacks. And then when you see, and you go deeper on the to investigating the investigations of these journalists, the majority of the attacks are linked to corruption and security investigations. So the journalists that are being attacked in Mexico is because they were investigating things related to corruption or security. And then the majority of attacks are perpetrated by public servants, that they're supposed to be the ones that guarantee protection. So it's kind of a loop that, of course, you understand why impunity is so high in terms of crimes against freedom of expression. And also, violence against the press in Mexico, it's embedded in a very hostile and environment. And it's you see it in a lot of news, at least for the last 20 years, we are in a context with severe violations of human rights happen on a daily basis. So in this, or within this context, the press, it's just in the middle, trying to keep doing their job, but then when the governments are the ones that attack you the most, and then to silence investigations that are directly about the state, then you can understand why it's just not working. And then, of course, you have one thing that you were mentioning, when you don't say the thing, no one is doing anything. So now the government is completely overlooking, ignoring, and just saying, oh, that the attacks and the killings of journalists is just not a state matter. Kind of like saying, we respect freedom of expression as never before. And then the president has this morning presidential conference from Monday to Friday, and then on Wednesday, they have a section called Who is Who in the Lies. And it's just like they choose, based on we don't know what, an article from any newspaper or any journalist, and they start saying, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie, he's lying, she's lying. So in a country where an attack against a press is registered at least every 14 hours, the response of the government is completely based in I don't know which reality. So because they are neglecting this reality, they are not doing anything to prevent it. So that's pretty much why the mechanism is just never going to be enough, for example.
And so, and I want to bring Matthew in a second, because obviously everything you're saying about the people who are most vulnerable is reflected in the example of Daphne Caruana Galizia. But I'm curious then if the problem isn't so much the mechanism as the environment, are we then focused on the wrong thing? Should we not be focused so much on the justice mechanisms? I'm playing devil's advocate slightly, but should we not be so focused on those mechanisms and be more focused on the broader environmental questions?
I think that yes, and I mean, it is not a yes or no answer, right? We should still strengthen the mechanism because it's necessary for everyone that is part of or beneficiary of. But at the same time, if the government and other institutions that are not creating more structural changes, it's just going to be an ending loop. So the mechanism every year needs more resources, more money, more people wanted to be part of it, because that's the only strategy that the government has. And it's impossible to tackle actually all the reasons or causes that create or generates violence against the press. So without tackling impunity, investigating corruption is just never going to be enough. So yes, we should strengthen the mechanism while doing other more structural changes.
Thank you. Matthew, I want to bring you in of perhaps all of the advocates for justice in the case of killings of journalists. Perhaps you and your family have been able to do the most in recent years. And I wonder, particularly in terms of getting, moving Malta to investigate, but also bringing in the whole of the European Union and getting change in terms of legislation. How have you done that, and what lessons do you think you can share about what works in terms of getting justice for murdered journalists?
Hey, thank you, Jodie. That's really kind of you to say, by the way. Everything has sort of happened. So, everything has been such a blur over the past couple of years that I sometimes forget to stop and think about what we've achieved so far, which is quite significant, I think. Even though we're only talking about one case, after all, or out of the 200 or so that press freedom organizations have to deal with every year. I guess what makes my mother's case stand out is that it is perhaps one of the most egregious examples of abuse and harassment that then leads up to a murder or an assassination. And also that we have an opportunity to actually get justice, thanks to all of the work that everyone has put in. But of course, it's because things within the European Union are set up in a bit of a different way to other regions of the world, where freedom to trade is tied to respect for rights and values. And that is what I think is fundamentally missing from other parts of the world. So I was really happy that someone pointed out that most murders are directly linked to investigations into corruption. And this is in fact the case. Yes, when you look at the CPJ statistics, I believe it's something like 60 to 80% of murdered journalists are murdered while investigating politics and reporting on politics and corruption. What has made it possible for us in Malta to do something to attack the root cause? What led the corruption that led directly to the murder? Because if you don't attack that, then you're never going to be able to get justice for the murder itself, unless you use investigations into corruption to remove corrupt people who are then going to interfere in the murder investigation. You're just never going to get anywhere. So to me, these international trade systems where freedom of trade is tied to this respect for rights and values, which I think we have done not such a bad job of setting up in the European Union, is really essential. And I think it's a really huge failure when large economies negotiate free trade deals and there is no respect for rights and values tied into those deals. I mean, that should be automatic. I really think that unless unless trade is affected, then nothing is ever going to really be done. The issue is going to remain a soft one. So unless we change these systems to make sure that if there is widespread impunity, if journalists are being murdered, left, right, and center, then free trade deals are affected, then no government is ever going to have the incentive to do anything. No population is really going to properly rise up to hold its government to account. Perhaps that's a bit of a radical idea, but I really think it is the way forward.
And we've certainly seen that, I think, more broadly outside of specifically the press freedom sphere of the use of sanctions against countries that seem to be directly involved in abuse of human rights. And one of the things that we at CPJ have been asking for more directly is that linkage between the sanctions and the abuse of press freedom. I want to also think about that in the case of context of Mexico and Israel. But Matthew, one of the other things that I'm conscious that you talk about is dealing with the corruption, addressing the corruption. And one of the things I think that's been striking about the work that you've been engaged in is things like the Forbidden Stories project. So picking up the stories that your mother would have been engaged in, or other journalists who have been killed have been engaged in. How important is it, and how much impact does it have to carry on writing and publishing the stories for which the journalists were being silenced?
I mean, it was hugely important. I mean, on a sort of, as a kind of legacy, like what I remember saying at the time was that the Daphne project by Forbidden Stories and all the other organizations that participated in the investigation brought my mother back to life. So for my family, it was a real boost to our campaign. It just made us feel like we had a lot of international backing, and I think gave us the strength to carry on what we were doing. But what it did do is bring my mother's investigations, the importance of them, the magnitude of them, to an international audience, especially within the European Union. And of course, this meant that we had more of an impact as a family when we went to speak at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, for example, or in committee meetings in the European Parliament, because people knew my mother's case, thanks to the reporting that had been done up to that point. So we could have a lot of impact in that way. That meant that then these mechanisms governed by European institutions that put pressure on the Maltese economy really worked. I mean, they were really effective. Our government was in a very sort of tough position where it couldn't just ride roughshod over our rights without affecting not just the international reputation of the country, but also its economy.
And I want to bring Paula in on that point about the international profile raising that happened through the Daphne project and others. Are journalists in Mexico feeling any impact from the international coverage that there has been of attacks on journalists? Is that having any kind of impact? And similarly, are people, I know that a number of journalists have come out in solidarity with one another over the killings. Is that having broader resonance? And this is, I guess, a bit to your point, Abderrahim, that is that having broader resonance with the public?
It has, but it hasn't been enough. And I think one of the things, and this might sound very tragic, but Mexico now is, like everyone knows, is a very violent country. So the killings of journalists is, again, in a context where we have more than 100,000 missing people, homicides every day. So it's very hard for society to keep like having the interest in one topic when it's just a very violent context. But I do agree that we should keep the topic in the spotlight, because it's just very tragic that a journalist is killed, and then you have the state, the Mexican government saying like, oh, this is a very democratic society, and they are increasing militarization of the country, and just this, like, we just have to keep having and speaking about the topic. But one of the key things that I think we have to do is like how, like, I'm not a journalist, but how we can strengthen the links between society and journalism. Because as Matthew was saying, like, when you kill a journalist, you kill the person, but you also kill the stories. Who is going to talk about these topics? Like, no one writes or talks or brings into the light the stories that Javier Valdez used to do, or Miroslava Bridge, and you name the journalists in Mexico. So we have to, one of the ways that we have to, and I think that to tackle impunity as well at the same time, is trying to recover all those stories and investigations, and as a society, always think about like, what is that journalist was talking about? Like, why he was killed? It was not, we cannot just say because, oh, Mexico is violent. Yes, of course it's violent, but why he was killed? The investigation was about who is involved in that investigation. So we have to, as a society, talk about that and push for these changes, because at this, like, we have been talking about this for the past 2 years, like for the past 2 days, sorry, like the impacts that the violence against journalism has in society in terms of political participation, right to information, right to protest, that are, of course, necessary and essential for democracies and for just the exercise of human rights.
And of course, if there's no justice over a long period of time, then the initial investigation or the piece of work that the journalist was doing may be forgotten over time, and that's one of the things that the Safer World for the Truth project that CPJ is involved with FPU and RSF is really trying to do, is bring those cases back to light. And I'm going to ask my colleague Leon to talk about that in a little while.
Can I just say one thing, and I think it's very important in terms of justice. Like, justice is not equal as identifying 1 or 2 or 3 material perpetrators. We have, or like investigation should identify intellectual perpetrators, but mostly justice is about reparation damage and guarantees of non-repetition.
Yeah.
So it's not just...
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about this in terms of what justice for Shireen looks like. But I also wanted to come back to your point that you made about the UN. What are the political levers that are going to put pressure, particularly on Israel, but in all of these cases where we see impunity? If the UN is not able to put pressure, if the US is now refusing to have an investigation into its own citizen, Shireen was a US citizen, if the case is not added to International Criminal Court appeal, what are the political levers that are going to achieve accountability and justice for somebody like Shireen?
Just a quick point pertaining to what Paula said, and then I'll get to the UN. One of the differences between the cases in Mexico, or at least some of them, in the case of investigative reporters getting killed, and what happens in Palestine, the case of Shireen Abu Akleh and her reporting. You obviously, excuse me if I can talk about Mexico, you keep the issue alive in a place like Mexico by explaining to people that investigating corruption and embezzlement is something that ties directly into their livelihood as ordinary people, as ordinary Mexicans, because money that needs to go, that should have gone to the education of their kids or to the health of their kids has now been embezzled. So you investigate and sometimes you get killed. There are cases where drug cartels also kill journalists and so on. But in the case of Shireen and journalists like Shireen, Shireen was a professional reporter. She never flagged the fact that she is Christian in her reporting, that is, or that she was Palestinian or that she was American. Her job, she saw it as shining a light on what was going on in an issue which is crucial to world war and peace, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israelis saw that as a threat. The Palestinians saw her reporting as, giving a body, a real embodiment to their cause, to millions of people across the Middle East and North Africa and well beyond. So killing her, the reason for killing her is coming from a different perspective. Now, with regard to the UN, I know that the Irish, for example, the mission of Ireland to the United Nations, have been very active in terms of press freedom in general for journalists globally, but particularly in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh. Ever since her killing, they've been very active in the Security Council, trying to work out proper wordings in statements, trying to actually mobilize action so that, you know, this doesn't happen again, number one. But also in terms of trying to achieve justice for Shireen and other reporters who were killed in the line of duty. This kind of conversation that we are having now, together with, in the specific case of the United States, for example, unless people mobilize inside the United States, and as I said, we're still lucky that we live in a country that values press freedom, the United States. But unless people mobilize in a significant way to put pressure on the US government of the day, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, whether the president is a Democratic president or like Joe Biden, or a Republican one like his predecessors, it's not gonna happen, because the US has way too much at stake in its relationship with Israel, and therefore pushing the Israelis to do something which the Israelis see as a threat to them, it seems to me it's not gonna happen without real pressure from within. We've seen the US left being very active, trying to mobilize and put pressure on the US government in the specific case of Shireen, but also in previous cases. But obviously that has not been enough. The statement that we saw from the State Department last week is testimony to the fact that internal pressure has not worked in the specific case of the United States. Having said that, we know that at the UN, there are a lot of countries in the membership of the United Nations. We know that the Secretariat General is very concerned about this. And as I said at the outset, I would love to be one day in a situation, I'd love it for us one day to say we have achieved Shireen for every journalist who was killed. But realistically, knowing what the stakes are and international relations and so on, that's not going to happen. That's a lofty goal. We should strive for it. But what we should really strive for in the short and medium term is to basically reduce the scope of impunity for the killers of journalists. And if we can get to the point one day of ending impunity for the killers of journalists, so much the better.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is essentially, unless we make this a much bigger public issue that puts pressure
Absolutely.
on governments, with all of the sort of our behind-the-scenes attempts to put pressure on governments to hold investigations, etc., is for nothing, effectively.
That's precisely what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in democratic countries which profess to be democratic, you know, we had Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, say that without press freedom, there is no freedom. So for democratic countries which profess to be democratic, unless they put that to action and they believe in it, unless they are pushed to actually believe in it by public opinion, the issue of ending impunity will remain a goal very hard to achieve. How do they that? It's precisely by keeping the issue live in the court of public opinion that we increase the chances that that may happen.
And Matthew, certainly that has proved that sort of public pressure, the publicity that surrounded your mother's case, that certainly proved the case for Daphne, and yet we haven't quite seen full justice. And I wonder for you and for your family what an end point looks like, where you feel that you've got justice and accountability for your mother.
The end point for us is justice for my mother's assassination. That means everyone involved in the assassination is convicted, and justice for her investigations into corruption, which means that there are prosecutions and convictions for the corruption cases that she investigated, especially the ones that led directly to her assassination. Of course, my family's campaign, I mean, combined with the campaigns that press freedom organizations ran in support, has been hugely effective. But it is not a solution that can be scaled. It's unrealistic to expect every single family to do this. My mother had 3 sons. We were all adults. She had 4 sisters, again, all adults. My father was a lawyer. You know, most people in my family are educated. We all speak English. This is obviously not the case for every single journalist's family. Many don't even have children, or they don't have a good relationship with their family, or their family members are intimidated. So how can we expect to scale this as a solution? Of course we cannot. It's not working, it's never going to work. As an emergency, as an urgent solution, yes, we need to put pressure on politicians. And making headway on one case can lead to headway being made in other cases, because barriers are broken down, for example. Bad people are removed, good people are put in place of them, in positions of authority, I mean. But again, I think we need something that is more focused on attacking the root cause. And another scalable solution, I think, is ensuring that there is proper recourse for family members, and that family members feel that they have access to these mechanisms of recourse, to these tools, if you will. For example, prosecutors that are not answerable to political figures, or not subject to political capture. International or intergovernmental organizations that can hold member states to account. These are important tools that allow families to access justice. But for the vast majority of the world's population, they simply don't exist. I mean, let's face it, nothing that the United Nations can offer is a proper tool that can offer any victim any proper recourse. So again, the vast majority of the world's population are simply left out or unable to access any mechanism for justice, let's say.
I think that's such an important point that, you know, we look to the example of, you know, relative, I suppose, success in your family's case and hope that that might be scalable and replicable, but for the reasons you've said, that's not possible. And I think particularly the point that you referenced about having recourse mechanisms and a trained judiciary are absolutely key in our experience to being able to have any kind of access to justice. I want to bring in Leon Willems from FPU, because he initiated a project called Safer World for the Truth that CPJ was involved in along with RSF, which was seeking to find a new way to address some of these particularly long-standing cases of impunity. And Leon, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the Safer World for the Truth project, and in particular, not just what it was, but also how it might be, in Matthew's words, replicable and scalable.
Well, the replicability and the scalable has, of course, a lot to do with resources. But let me just try to point out very briefly what we were aiming to do. I think what we were aiming to do is fight nihilism and the resignation to impunity, because we are speaking about this issue, but there are so many cases, and there's a lot of resignation, even in the journalist community, that this is a fact of life. Secondly, we were thinking we need to uncover new strategies to fight impunity, because obviously issuing statements and making appeals to the United Nations bodies don't matter enough. And then thirdly, we wanted to reinvigorate the idea of joint advocacy. Because in many cases, especially locally, you see that a lawyer or a small press freedom organization or a civil society organization takes up the case, but there's no support mechanism. So what we did is basically investigate cold cases that were relatively important for the journalist community in a certain country, For example, in the Central African, and we were looking at cases where there's no light on, right? And so the case, for example, of Blanche Onofrio in the Central African Republic was killed because of an attack that rebels had on her for reporting the truth about ethnic violence in the Central African Republic. But the reason that she died is basically because she wasn't treated properly. She didn't die from the attack. She died from the fact that she wasn't hospitalized. And the reason for that was that nobody wanted to give an emergency visa for her to take her to hospital in Kenya.
Leon, sorry, can I ask you to stand up?
Oh,
Then
sorry.
you'll be on the camera.
Yeah. So we use that as a strategy to advocate for emergency visa. And we're not there, but we're close to getting emergency visa implemented for these kinds of cases. In the case of Zubair Mujahid in Pakistan, we found that the police department that he was writing about in terms of corruption was involved in the investigation for the murder. And the investigation was done improperly. We found witnesses that were not heard. We found forensic evidence that the place where a drive-by shooting had taken place was not investigated properly. And we used that material to reopen the case. In the case of Jerry Ortega in the Philippines, because apart from the atrocious fact that 81% of the journalist murders are not prosecuted, 95% of the cases, the mastermind behind the killing is not identified. Jerry Ortega was killed by a person that was standing for election for governor in the Philippines. So we came out with the investigation 1 month in advance of the elections, and he was not elected. So these are all small successes, but the thing is, it reinvigorates the idea that something can be done. We did a hearing with partners in Mexico on the case of Milo Vela, and the first time in 10 years, established periodicals like periodicals who hadn't written about journalist killing for 10 years after the Veracruz murders started publishing again. So it's about reinvigorating. So doing these investigations, but connecting them to a joint strategy with people who care can actually lead to success. But let me just try to say 3 more things that I just jotted down because I think they would be important. One of the things that is missing in our view in the international justice system is that most killings of journalists are seen as a right to life crime. They're not seen as freedom of expression crime. It's very difficult to prove, but it means basically that what the journalist that is killed was writing about, or the investigation they were doing, or like in the case of Shireen, shining the light on a conflict scene where atrocious thing happened that nobody wants to get out in the open. In this case, the mass intrusion into Jenin in the West Bank. This means that the story that people were working on are not immediately seen by justice institutions as a reason to investigate. And we think this is one of the most important things that we hope will come out of the tribunal that is going to happen on the 19th of September in The Hague, is that a panel of judges will recommend that the story that a journalist is writing about is a prime reason for investigation for all justice departments. So we need to reinvigorate the justice system as well, because, for example, in the case of Pakistan, the drive-by shooting was seen as a violent incident. Many cases in Mexico are seen as violent incidents. And I think that with investigations, especially in, let's say, mock democracies or illiberal democracy, let's say democracies which have the face value of democracy, but there are many federal or sub-federal levels where impunity and corruption reigns, it is possible to reinvigorate these things. And I think that one of the things that on a higher level we need to look at, all of us together, is that in almost all the cases where journalists are killed, there's a story in advance where people have been threatened. Yeah. And we're not documenting and we're not being alert enough in that early stages where we can actually protect people before they get killed or before they get in harm's way. So I think that those are a couple of points I would like to share with you. We hope to continue, of course, with the help of many, these investigations. We're still going to continue with our work for a year. Last thing I want to say is that we're currently also doing a big data research study, because one of the assumptions that journalists are killed because a country is simply a dangerous country, when we're looking at the big data, but we're still in the middle of our conclusions, it is not true that a country that has high impunity therefore also has high impunity for cases of journalists killed. There are other reasons, which points back to my earlier point. The reason why journalists are killed is in the work that they do. Almost never is just, I mean, I don't want to, any killing is bad, but it's not just a crime threat to life.
Thank you, Gail. And I think that early warning point is absolutely crucial, right? You know, we see it time and time again that the threats of violence or actual violence is preceded by the threats of violence and preceded, as we know in the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia, often by legal threats as well. And those are things that should start all of our alarm bells ringing so that we can start to put in protection mechanisms so that we're not dealing with the aftermath of a killing. We're in the preventative stages, which is much more, which is where you want to be, as opposed to trying to achieve justice for a terrible crime. Well, that's what I wanted to say, and I think one of the things that you point up is investigating particularly crimes that are 10 years old is extraordinarily resource intensive. So the amount of work that needs to go into re-interviewing individuals, accessing people's computers to pull up the stories they were working on is extraordinarily labor-intensive, resource-intensive, and yet there is very little funding for that work, I think, internationally. I think that's one of the things that we need to see more of is investment in that kind of thing. We have a little time for questions. I think we have one at the back here and then this gentleman here.
Thank you so much. My name is Issa Mansari from Sierra Leone originally, but I published the Africa paper in Minneapolis and the Africa Institute for International Reporting. So I go back and forth in West Africa and Sierra Leone. I was there about 3 months back. So my view about justice and press freedom, for example, in Sierra Leone, a politician attacked a newspaper that was called For the People newspaper. The assistant editor at that time, Harry Sane, was brutally beaten and they died around 1998, 2000. So they came all the way from London to Sierra Leone because their mom called them that these journalists are writing a lot of story. And after that, they went back to Britain. To this day, nothing has never been done. They are still in London. They are free. Ari Ansane and his kids and his family are still suffering. When I went back to Sierra Leone, the former editor of the paper explained he was depressed because I worked for the paper before. So what do we do in terms of this? Somebody killed a journalist with the family. They fled back to London after doing that. Then they were never sent back to the country to be prosecuted. That is one we have to look at. Then the other thing is that in Sierra Leone, they formed a media commission, the Independent Media Commission, which stands between the country, the government, and the journalists themselves to see how they address that. But even that one is supported by the government, so nothing much is done. Then what we have to look again is the laws and the justice system in each country. How do they address the media problem, journalist prosecution? These are things that have never been addressed, and the system of the journalist and the law do not seem to be working in collaboration. The justice, overnight you are charged for what they call careless talk, for talking against the government. Then you go to the courts, they change the law, they say, you have been prosecuted for libel, for seditious libel. So that is what we have to look again. And the other thing, again, I realized after visiting West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, what we have to understand is rapid reporting about journalism and journalists being prosecuted. When I went to Sierra Leone, there was another journalist that was hit by a car, but there was no rapid report about this issue. He suffered in silence. So the international community and, of course, the local journalists, we should be addressing that immediately so that we know what is happening. Then the presence of the international journalism community, CPJ, IPI, Article 19, and others. In this country, most of the journalists suffer in silence because the international community does not show immediately when they are affected. So they feel left out. That was one of the frustrations they were telling me. We have never seen CPJ visiting us to understand our plight. What about your colleagues at the IPI? I said, well, they are coming. So these assurances need to be there so that when things like this happen, they're present. I was in Sierra Leone when they were attacked. I was trying to call and see if I would be able to talk to a few friends. So at least once a year or so, just visit the region and understand and try to get their plight and hold a meeting, maybe with the government and the stakeholders to understand what is the plight of their colleagues. I think these are all the issues that are on the table. And of course, the fight is still continuing. So these are some of the things I just want us to take a look at.
Thank you. And all of those points you raise are absolutely key. Solidarity is vital. Rapid reporting and raising of issues we know is crucial. The legislative environment. I wanted to maybe, Matthew, ask you about this international justice question, because this question of what can be done when individuals who are suspected or known to be responsible, what can be done using the international community to bring them to justice?
I mean, you can't bring anyone to you can shout as much as you like, but you can't bring anyone to justice unless some kind of a justice system that is accessible exists. And at the moment, there is simply no such thing.
And do you think that we are beginning to see that change, a willingness for countries that notionally support press freedom to not just call out other countries that are not supporting press freedom, but actually support in efforts to punish those responsible for crimes against journalists? Do you see that shifting?
I mean, I sort of defer to the lawyers in the room about this, but I think something needs to be done to reform the whole idea of jurisdiction when it comes to crimes that have some kind of transnational aspect. Most corruption nowadays involves moving money across borders, banks in different jurisdictions, shell companies in different jurisdictions. Many journalists are investigating these issues, or bribery that involves some kind of transnational money laundering or organized crime of some nature, or perhaps a foreign company involved in bribery. I mean, in those cases, for the family of a victim or the friends of a victim or whoever, to access justice is extremely difficult. It's extremely complex. In my mother's case, it's been a huge issue. And I mean, the more complex the case, then obviously the greater the cost. And of course, we have this completely warped system where the lawyers, the accountants, the politicians who defend criminals or who work with criminals reap immense rewards. I mean, they are paid enormous sums of money to do this kind of work, lobbying, I mean, legal defense. Whereas the press freedom advocates, the human rights defenders, the lawyers who take on pro bono work, I mean, for God's sake, even the UN rapporteur, isn't even paid a salary, or perhaps is paid a salary, but has absolutely no budget to do any kind of her work. So the reward system is completely warped.
Yeah.
People who work on these matters in the public interest tend to be punished or deprived or increasingly deprived of resources, where the people who work in favor of private interest, in favor of criminals or crooked politicians, human rights abusers, dictators, are rewarded for that work.
Yes, unfortunately, that's, I think, something that will take some time to shift, but I'm hopeful that people in the room are actively engaged.
I believe we can do it in a generation.
Gentleman here had a question.
Yeah, my name is Musikilu Majid. I'm editor-in-chief Premium Times in Nigeria and chair of the IPI Nigerian National Committee. So my colleague was talking about the need for a new strategy. And he also talked about joint advocacy, which is something that I'm passionate about, that when these cases happen, press freedom organizations tend to work in silo, and you issue a statement. This one, IPI issues a statement, CPJ issues a statement, and then there is no coordination about, because the more you coordinate, the more energy you have to push for justice. I think it's something we really need to look at. How do we bring all the energy that we have to push for justice? Now, there is this issue when you want to apply for visa, whether to the US or to the UK or to the European Union, where they say, have you ever engaged in trafficking, in human trafficking? Have you ever been convicted? So I've been thinking about it, and I think impunity against journalists would be one of the questions that should be raised when people are seeking visa. Have you ever been accused of impunity against journalists? So if people know that there are consequences, and this is something that we can lobby about, we can lobby the UN, we can lobby countries. So if people know, because usually when IPI or CPJ issue statement, when journalists are detained or arrested or killed or something, the people engaged, sometimes they are released, the journalists are released, they go back to their work, but the people involved in that impunity are never held accountable. It happens all the time. These people get to travel to the capitals of the West and everywhere. But if we can hold them accountable, there are consequences. You are unable to travel, because if the US says, look, media impunity is a huge crime, for which if you commit impunity against journalists, there is a possibility that you are not going to move beyond your country's border. For a country like mine, that will be a huge deterrence for politicians. And I think it's something that we should think strongly about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Abderrahim, that works if you know who's responsible, right? But in the case, say, of someone like Shireen, where we no one, it looks like currently, is going to be held accountable for her killing, what consequences do you think we could impose that would deter people from targeting journalists?
So obviously there are at least three categories of entities that we could talk about here. We could talk about governments, we could talk about non-state actors, drug cartels and so on. And we could talk about governments that are either democratic or not democratic. And I suppose that the onus, there's much more of an onus on democratic countries to not just aid investigating the killing of journalists, but also to put into place policies that would act as deterrent in this case. With pressure, democratic countries are much more amenable to being pressured into doing things than tyrannical governments, obviously. In the case of non-state actors, I think for me, there's a huge question mark there as to what can be done to get non-state actors to abide by a code of conduct when it comes to killing journalists, whether we're talking about drug cartels in Latin America, or we're talking about ISIS or other similar groups in the Middle East, or Boko Haram in Nigeria, or and so on. But what gives me hope, and it is a pretty hopeless case, trying to think exactly what can be done and how do you bring it about to stop the killing of journalists in the first place, let alone investigating the crime after it had happened. What gives me a little bit of hope is that even as democracy globally is coming under attack, there are still governments that are committed, not just in words, but also in action, to press freedom and to helping protect journalists. Unfortunately, you get to a stage or a situation like Shireen's, where we know that it's a government, it's the army of a government that killed the journalist, but we also know that there is another government, the most consequential government, the government of the United States, which issues surreal statements like the one they issued last week about the IDF's report that there will not be an investigation in the case of the soldier who killed Shireen Abu Akleh.
We're coming to the end of our time, and I liked the way that you ended there with what gives you hope. So I want to ask you, Paula, what gives you hope that we might see justice for murdered journalists, but more broadly, that we might start to see a change in this trend of aggression and threats towards journalists?
Well, several things I think. One is like in 2017 when Javier Valdez was killed, there were like massive social mobilizations asking for justice on his case. And then after that and before that, in terms of the killing of journalists, not really any social response. But then this year we have seen, after the killing of Margarito Martinez and Lourdes Maldonado and Jose Luis Gamboa in the north of Mexico, we have seen like massive social mobilizations organized by journalists. They happen like in more than 64 cities simultaneously, and that's something that we haven't seen before. So I think that's one thing. We have seen more human rights defenders and journalists getting together. In the case of Mexico, and maybe because we are always trying to see what else we can do, we're strengthening also links between organizations such as CPJ, RSF, Article 19, and other local organizations. So we are more like, I think that the biggest hope is just on the networks, right? Collective changes. And because of history of humankind, collectiveness is what is going to push for actually more changes. So
Thank you. Matthew, what gives you hope?
Very good question. I don't know. I mean, it's to do this kind of work, you just have to have an innate sense of justice and really want to achieve it above anything else. Of course, we always hope that something will be done and the situation will change. But I think more than a sense of hope, it's a sense of frustration and the hatred of injustice that really drives me. Like my mother, I just cannot stand for people's rights to be trampled upon, for them to be disrespected, for the corrupt to win, for them to be allowed to bully everyone else. This situation just outrages me completely. And it's really that which drives me.
Another thing.
Especially speaking of my own country, I mean, it's just an intolerable situation, and I know that many people are dealing with similar situations in their own countries. I believe that this sort of shared sense of purpose should unite us.
Thank you, Matthew.
There's another thing which gives me hope, if I may just say quickly. The other thing that gives me hope is that at the end of the day, despite all the obstacles, there are a lot of people globally who are seriously committed to defending press freedom and to trying to end impunity. And the other thing, I'm thinking of one of my favorite novels by Alan Paton, a white South African writer who wrote about apartheid, Cry the Beloved Country. And Cry, in our case, Cry, the journalists, our colleagues who have been killed. Crying is fine, it's part of the human condition. And so is the yearning for justice. That gives me hope. No matter what the killers of journalists think, at the end of the day, we yearn for justice, and because we yearn for it, there are many of us who are absolutely rock solid determined to pursue it.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of all the panelists, I'd like to thank you for listening. Hundreds of journalists still seek justice, and I'm hopeful that many of the initiatives and ideas that we've shared today will achieve that. And particularly, I absolutely take your point that we are stronger if we can do this together, and we are coordinated and collaborative. And I think that, above all things, is going to finally see some change. So thank you all, and thank you to IPI for hosting us today.